when we come to the subject of psychosynthesis, the whole structure of the word suggests a putting together. And putting together the human entity as a unit of consciousness is indeed a difficult task. Whether you are high-born or whether you are primitive in origin, it is a difficult task always to gather the various elements of the human nature and form them into a single sovereign entity that can make decisions. And of course, in Theosophy, we are aware that we have not only to make decisions in this world, the world of reality, the world of matter and form, but we are expected to make decisions in the world of the esoteric, the spiritual, the subjective. We are expected, therefore, to be able to operate in two worlds at once. Not that we should live in this world less, but that we should learn to live in both worlds more. And that is what we're talking about tonight. The ability to operate as a whole entity. And I would remind you of the importance of the word holism today. The holistic nature of man is as important as the holistic nature of an elephant or of a palm tree. And if we cannot operate at any time as a holistic entity, then we are failing in our incarnation. And incarnation is repeated again and again so that we can put ourselves together and function as a holistic being, thus reflecting the greater one in whom we live and move and have our nature. And that in itself is an immense concept, that we are living within the body of a greater being. Not so long ago, you read the book Gaia by a modern scientist who began to take an ancient concept called hylozoism, the ancient Greek proposition that all things live, to the maximum, to the greatest extent, and considered that the earth was a living being, a sentient living thing, and if anything like other living things, this living thing, which is the earth, has its responses to illness or disease conditions or planetary contamination. And he maintained this proposition in order to say, let us have a look at this proposition that the earth is a living thing, because it may be reacting to planetary conditions, and how it has reacted in the past, perhaps a dozen times over the last 4 billion years, we may learn something from that. And planetary warming may have been responded to by this living entity, Gaia, in the past. How did it respond? How should we respond? Therefore, learning from our theosophy that all things live, and all things live within the body of a greater being. And so the subject appears on the outside to be complex. By that I mean, of course, psychosynthesis. I studied psychosynthesis under the originator of the therapy. It was Robert Assagioli, a nice man, a Jew, who had been imprisoned during the Second World War by the Nazis of Italy, and had learnt from the experience, like Viktor Frankl. These are important names if you want to read up things on the internet. Viktor Frankl, logotherapy, was an inmate also of a Nazi concentration camp. Robert Assagioli, who was the originator of psychosynthesis, had also a similar experience. I did my associated work with Sheffield Medical School, where I was graduating in medicine. I did the associate work with Robert Assagioli and went to Italy and studied under him. He taught me many things. I hope I taught him a few things as well. We compared notes, and he had by then almost fashioned the subject of psychosynthesis. Now I'm going to do a drawing which is meant not to stagger you. I'm not a pedantic person. I don't like to push erudition in front of my students, but merely to show you the complexity of the matter of putting yourself together. And we all know what it's like to be under stress. We all know that it takes energy to hold ourselves together sometimes. We may be threatened by a crisis, financially, domestically, tragically, dozens of ways in which we can undergo stress, and we know how exhausting it is, perhaps in a painful disease or condition, to hold ourselves together so that we can express our sovereign entity, our sovereign nature. Now, psychosynthesis takes into account the fact that there are hidden structures which interpenetrate and operate through man. One of them is the human psyche, which is related to subjects like the unconscious, the collective unconscious, and had to be expressed by extraordinarily wonderful figures like Professor Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, and of course Assagioli. And so let us now look at the picture that I'm going to draw for you, so as to understand that what we learn here under psychosynthesis can embrace the structures that I'm going to try and demonstrate in the picture of the true nature of man. More than that, the total nature of man. We of course know and understand the physical structure of man. I spent 7 years in a medical school learning about it. And we only know part of the truth because the huge unexplored area of the brain awaits investigation of a serious dimension. The proposition is that the physical body is only the outer shell of the man, of the human, and that we are like an iceberg, in that only part of us shows, 1/10 of man shows as an iceberg, by analogy, above the level of the water. The rest of man is hidden. That's a valuable analogy, and in the esoteric we are always using it. We understand something of the physical body, certainly, but we're also aware from theosophical teachings that there is an interpenetrating physical structure, and there is dispute in theosophy as to whether the structure really exists, and the reason is that it is physical, and part of its nature has only recently been discovered. And I'm talking, of course, about the etheric body, the etheric matrix, in suggesting that the physical body forms within an etheric matrix or structure which formulates the physical atoms and molecules about it. I have done a lot of work investigating the nature of this etheric body. My friend Geoffrey Farthing doesn't believe that it exists. I have held a neutral ground, studied carefully the different factors relating to it. And my conclusion is that today, with the advent or the discovery of ribonucleic acid, the RNA molecule, which is the messenger of the DNA coding, that this throws new light on the existence of an etheric body. That's not my subject tonight, except we understand that it is possible through theosophical mechanisms to stimulate the etheric body in order to make the physical body more effective. We're also aware that there is an emotional structure, the astral body, made up of very fine particles, not the finest, but fine particles, and represents part of the astral world interpenetrating the earth. This is the earth. Then there is an astral world interpenetrating the earth, at least for a depth of 10 or 20 miles below the surface of the earth, and reaching out as far as the moon. We have recently given a seminar here on the astral body, the astral world, and the techniques of astral projection, and you will find this useful in your study of the nature of psychosynthesis. This is the emotional body of man. It's the emotional nature of man, and it can be integrated. Its senses, its astral senses, can be brought into efficiency and function, and it can be controlled to such an extent that it may be projected beyond the brain, carrying the consciousness with it far distances. The astral body. Then we must consider also that which exists fairly rarely to any extent in man, and that is the mental nature. And the mental body is really something that is presumed existing in all humans, but is very, very difficult to observe in people unless they are scientific or highly organized businessmen, have got strong mental bodies, but the mental body is still hardly formed. The effect of these structures is that they pass energy through them, and the energy that passes through them creates an effluent, a discharge of used up or transformed energy, which contributes to the nature of what we call the human aura. An effluent of mento, astral, etheric energies pouring from the surface and different parts of the human vehicle. We're also aware from the studies of clairvoyance like Leadbeater that there tends to be a vortex of energy passing into the slowly rotating aura or the atom of man. And there is at the same time, there is a torrent of emission from the lower region of the spine in man, suggesting again an atom. Even with all these components, and they represent by integration the personality of man, even with all these elements, this is not the complete picture. And we have to understand that at even higher levels, higher planes of existence, there is another entity in the equation of man's consciousness, and this is said to be the soul. The existence of the human soul with its gloire, its emission of spiritual energies depending on the age of the soul. And we must understand that man is not born equal. Despite the teachings of the French Revolution, of liberty, equality, and fraternity, there is a difference in the ages of man. And man may have had as few as 10, 30, 50, 100 lives on the earth, or he may have had as many as 600 lives on the earth, and therefore the spiritual entity, the age of the soul within him, greatly affects the equation that we're talking about, which is the consciousness of man. We say that there is a constant contact between the higher self, or that's a psychological term for the soul. A higher self, the important thing that we maintain, Asajoli, Jung, is that the higher self is an immortal structure. It is immortal in that it lives on and on, at least in a percentage of individuals, it lives on and can claim the title of being immortal, but we must also understand the modern term for the study of this kind of phenomenon as being transpersonal, above the level of the personality. There is a consciousness that is deposited into. And if you hear talk in the esoteric about a cosmic bank, this is what is being referred to. That no matter what the results are in the physical world, in the plane in which your personality functions, no matter what the results, there are deposits in the cosmic bank, the cosmic entity, and there are appropriate New Testament-y descriptions of this factor. Now, I have not labeled any of these structures because I'm assuming that being theosophists, or knowing theosophy, you are aware of most of these structures. What I have to do is to point out some important factors here. We are talking about a range of particles that is from the tiniest imaginable. You know what they are because you are able to create thought forms. You are manipulating with your mental body thought material. And I'm talking about particles, emotional particles certainly, 1,000,000 times smaller than the atomic nucleus of the hydrogen atom. Astral particles, sometimes existing as emotional energy, particles which have been or are being converted into waves. Formerly, no scientific basis for this at all. Today, it's all changed. There are particles, vast amounts of them. We say forming a plane, planes, emotional planes, astral planes, of particles 1,000,000 times smaller than the hydrogen atom's nucleus. We call it astral substance. And we have a body of astral substance. And this astral substance may be converted very dynamically into emotional energy, and with the emotional energy we not only hold the bodies together, but we are able to discharge it, and discharge it effectively in emotional creativeness, in artistic form, in sport, in competition, in hunting, in gathering. From the very earliest days of human consciousness and physical body, we have been able to be creative because we have cave walls in which our ancients, 50,000 years ago, were drawing pictures of the things that were most colorful to them. And what was most colorful for them was a herd of leaping gazelle, orange-brown skins and shining eyes and black horns and so on. Nature. And there it was. They were trying to depict it on the walls of caves because they were bored stiff in the middle of winter, hiding in caves to survive the cold spells on the surface of Europe. And so all this takes us back. And we begin to understand that man is a complex being, and that the esoteric teachings tell us, man, know thyself. If you know yourself, you shall know the universe, or at least parts of it. Very important admonition. And don't do it by poking into it with a curious mind. It's not good enough. Drink deep, or taste not the Pierian spring. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. And that applies to the fact that the various bodies that I have described are organized into force centers. Naturally, what would you expect when two lines of force cross each other, even if it's the Christian cross? It implies a vortex, not a vortex, but a center of energy, which develops into what we know as the chakras. All this is, of course, elementary to most of us. And there are 2 points of consciousness in man. There is the point of consciousness which we associate with awareness, with a sovereign entity that makes the final decision that you're going to move from point A to point B, or do this or do that. And this is centered somewhere in the midbrain. And there is another point of consciousness in the atrioventricular node of His, in the heart, which is the center, the anchoring point for the life force. Life and consciousness. And we have, of course, a caduceus representing the 2 streams of consciousness, and a central rod representing the brain and the spinal column, or cord, within it, which we call the caduceus. And so, through understanding more of our nature, we begin to take in symbols and extend our awareness increasingly so that we can grasp subjects like immortality. It's no good talking about reincarnation and how many lives on the earth if you cannot conceive of immortality. The only possible future for the idea of reincarnation is that we are immortal. And the immortality is consolidated by the fact that we are beginning to probe areas in the nature of our planet and its population which suggest immortality, suggest that it may be possible to control the elements of the genome, and that we may even be able to get a body to live for 1,000 years, or 2,000 years of physical body, or that we may be able to discover life on other planets, extraterrestrial life. It is said, as you well know, that the arrival of one single flying saucer, or the arrival of one single extraterrestrial being on the planet Earth, would immediately wipe out the slate of all the religions. The religions would be meaningless if one such advanced individual came to the Earth. Well, of course, it was Theosophy that hammered this in to the Western mind with the original Adamski concept and flying saucers and beings from Venus. Because if we were studying tonight the origin of man, we would be aware that there had been an inner round of civilizations on planets nearer to the sun. And this inner round had suggested advanced beings on Mercury for a short time, but then onto Venus. An immense subject. But now we must understand that there are, it is said, two links of man's consciousness to his higher nature. And these two links coming down through the planes, one of them is the consciousness link to the brain, the midbrain especially, near the pineal gland. And the second link is to the atrioventricular node in the heart, which pumps life force into the body, as Annie Besant talks about in her book, A Study in Consciousness. But then we have to look at the nature of the immortal part of us. And it's the hardest part of us to accept as a factor of reality. Partly because we have grown used to scientific investigation, to breaking things down into small parts and looking at them, not look at the human body as an entity or even this extraordinary proposition, but to look at the cells of the body and then to break it down further from the cells into the molecules of the cells, the DNA and the RNA, and from there down into the atoms and the nuclei of the atoms. And there are parts of this material, as I say, that one moment exist as particles, and the next moment may exist as waves of energy. And particles may change as you study them with your eyes, and something comes from the eyes, and that's an esoteric teaching, which can make particles change into waves. And so these extraordinary propositions are now being discovered in science and in quantum physics, and we must bear them in mind. The soul. You heard me talk about the inequalities of man, and how there may be many, many lives previous to this one on the earth, maybe on neighboring planets like Venus, as we have suggested, and for the very advanced, even on Mercury, and that this soul is a unit of energy. It's of an energy of very, very high quality. We must understand that when we chase back the origins of material that we inhabit, clothe ourselves with, we end up with the concept of the divine. The concept and idea that there is a God. Maybe he is a mental thought form of an even greater God. We don't know those answers to those matters. But when we start to look into the nature of God, we can't go back much further than the concept of fire. My God is an all-consuming fire, and that we are sparks of this fire, which Theosophy calls monads. And we have in each of us the human monads, and there are 63,000 million of us, 63 billion, using this planet and taking on forms progressively from mere flows of energy right down into harnessing physical atoms and molecules. And so we talk about three planes in which there exists the immortal part of us. And these planes are divine will, or Atma. And Atma interpenetrates everything below it, like the next plane, which is Buddhi. And Buddhi is the plane of intuition, manifests in you and me as intuition. And we get a flash of intuition when we put truth together. Sometimes it happens by accident. We think of a train of events and we wonder to ourselves, was it true that this happened or will happen or is happening now? And suddenly there is a discharge of energy through us, and we know intuitively that what we have thought of or what we have presented to our consciousness is true. And that comes from the plane of buddhi, on which the soul exists. And then lastly, or closer to us, is the plane of abstract thought or higher mind. Higher manas, we call it. The lower mind is lower manas. Manas, the lower mind, we understand clearly. It's mental substance. And we conceive in it very easily. We're very good at it. We're good here in the West of practicing active intelligence, which is the manipulation of the mental plane to give us thought forms. The thought forms act as directives to the motion of our body, the activity of our brains, and we move from point A to point B. We call it linear thinking and action. We do it very well, and we've brought it almost to its limits here in the West. But there is a higher form of thinking. We call it higher manas, abstract thought. The ability to think of things that have nothing whatever to do with our evolution in the sense of in our evolution in the sense of our survival. We can see a mountain, as any animal can do, but we can observe the blueness of the mountain and relate it to things that are aesthetic and beautiful and truthful and just. We call this abstract thinking. And when we go into the subject of abstract thought, and we will deal with it eventually in this course, when we go into the subject of abstract thought, we find that it is possible to think in categories of thought, not just one thought. I'm going to walk to the door, left, right, left, open the door and go out and so on. But to think in categories, a whole series of thoughts moving, converging towards one intent. And these thoughts can be driven by the will, Atma, the top one of these three planes. And we see the thought driven into action, driven into materialization, the will behind a business, the will behind a great idea. The Florence Nightingale, that was the will and the abstract thinking of women going into battle areas to tend to hurt men instead of men tending men, eventually leading to the Red Cross movement and the widespread, extraordinary event in the last month, 2 months, where you have war with compassion. There's no good sniggering at it or sneering at it. It's a damn good experiment in human relationships. Paracelsus probably started it. The theosophical, if you like, initiate of the 16th century, when as a surgeon, an army surgeon, he had the audacity to tend both the enemy as well as his own men. Tended them both, the wounded of both sides. And that's what I mean about abstract thought, how it can lead you off into regions of pondering and thinking and considering that have nothing to do with tomorrow's bread and butter and how we're going to pay for the car and so on. Abstract thinking. And so many of us want to get in touch with the immortal part of us. And if we only knew about it, and we knew that that was the ultimate aim, end of everything, of all our struggles, we would take courage to stand up to some of the challenges of life that at the moment we can't bear. Creative energy, for instance. You know as well as I do, the dietitians have scraped the bottom of the barrel of metabolism. There are no more calories to be gained from changes in diet. We know all about food. We can burn it and assess the amount of calories and everything. But we can't get enough energy from eating to satisfy what is now being demanded of us, and that is spiritual expression. And we say that there is such energy. The muses of Rome used to bring it to the artists. They'd bring it down through the plains. And how else were the Romans able to describe it except as being gods, even if they were minor gods who brought energies down to the artist, to the poet, to the sculptor, and so on. And so we say that it is possible to link yourself with a unit of energy, the immortal part of us, and derive from it creative energies, creative forces, if you like, which lie behind the aesthetic intent, the determination of you as a human being to beautify the planet. Now, you may not see it like that, but in the end, that's what it means. Because in the end, all humans are responsible for the destiny of the planet. Who else? Who else is responsible for the destiny of this planet? And of the humans that are here, there's only a tiny little group who's aware of this sort of thing, and the destiny of the earth, and its purpose, and the logoi, the Gaias that have inhabited the body of the earth. And you and I are responsible for the destiny of the planet. Tremendous responsibilities. And so it's in my interest, if you like, if I can be very personal, it's in my interest that you understand that this entity, this unit of energy is there. And it gives off creativeness if you could contact it. And the safest way we know of making contact is through meditation. And another way that it is made more facile to reach us, this creative energy, is by not working for ourselves, for our personalities, but by working for humanity. If you want to know the mechanics are simple. That there is a chakra in the neck, which is an axis between two glands called the carotid body glands, which lie in the bifurcation of the carotid artery in the neck, one on each side. And vortices of energy pass into this chakra, and it rotates sagittally, and we call it the alta major. Alice Bailey called it the alta major, the other major center in the head. And all we know is that, no matter how you do it, by serving selflessly mankind, this chakra is opened. So, man, know thyself, and we begin to understand how we can encourage the higher self. Some say, and I'm one of these who say, that it is a manasaputra. It is a remnant of high mental beings who once used Mercury and Venus millions of years ago, and now resides, all right, we'll say, in the precincts of the planet, and cannot develop spiritually any further in their evolution unless they interact with a human. And we call such a being, even if it's temporary, we call such a being a higher self or the soul. And the soul cannot work through a human that is oriented towards material things. Just can't do it. It is only when a person has involved himself in material existence, in form, to such an extent that he is nauseated by it. I've had enough. I've tried everything on the planet. That he begins to turn, is there nothing else? Or he has an inner experience through this vehicle which says, Douglas, Douglas, come back, come back. And our family calls us back. Give it all up. And it's damned hard to give it up when you've struggled for it. And you are a personality that has involved yourself to the utmost and are successful and have friends that applaud your success. And then in the midst of it all, you have to make that tremendous decision, sometimes many times in many lives, to return to your consciousness to its origin. And that's what theosophy is all about. And psychosynthesis is a method whereby we can progressively learn to do this. And so from the soul we expect four things. As we become closer and closer to this higher being, don't call it your soul, it is the soul. Because that higher being has a shared consciousness with other souls, the one soul. And as we draw closer to it, there are four things. The soul begins to give you direction. So many people reach 40 or 45 or 50, and they say, I'm 50 years old, what the hell have I done with my life? I've thrown it away. I've had opportunities which I've not taken. I've blundered in where angels fear to tread. And they say, if I only knew why, if I only knew what to do, give me a sign, tell me, show me. And the soul can do it. The higher self can do it for you. Maybe not in English, or in Zulu, or in Chinese, but it'll do it certainly symbolically if no other way, and if you know your symbols, you will have a good communication with your higher nature. So direction, and then meaning to your life. If I only knew why do I have to go on with this repetitive work, day after day after day after day, until I am sick of it? And then you find that the higher self begins to give you the reason for it. And as your life works out, I'm using things that I learnt as an office boy when I was 15 and 16 years old. I'm using them today. Not they now dominate my life, far from it, but they're damn useful things that I had to learn as a kid. Yes, meaning to the life. Creativeness I've talked about. And of course there is, allow me to look at my notes, purpose in your life. If there was a purpose for war, then war might be justified, for some people anyway. If there was no purpose for it, if there were Huns coming out of the desert or the mountains, and there was no purpose for it, we would grieve. but there is purpose behind the immense movements on the planet, immense movements in thought, immense movements even in racial movements, immigration and emigration. Britain transferred 25 million of its best inhabitants to foreign parts after the Second World War. We forget that, but it was for a good reason. The United States had slavery, brought into the country a huge amount of slaves from tribal states in Africa, brought them in, and were surprised that these slaves should go into a state as a totality of melancholia, especially along the Mississippi, which was a river, and they had come from areas where there were great rivers. And today we can understand that they have to emerge from their melancholia in order to take the opportunities, and so on, as you well know. And so we turn, as you would turn to your mother, as the Catholic would turn to the Virgin Mary. We can turn inwardly to the higher self. You don't need me, you've got it. Turn inwards to your higher self, and there are methods of doing it. And the Theosophists have left, of course, behind them techniques for doing this. And the literature, the glorious literature of Theosophy. The voice of the silence, light on the path, the secret doctrine. Just go on and on and on. And you must dip into these. And so, if I may just finalize this section. Dipping into them means earnest study. And if you study these classics, and they're concerned with turning yourself around, and instead of pouring the light energy, the light of the golden flower out of your eyes into the world, which is fair enough, to turn and look inwards. Because observation changes what you observe, and that is now a scientific fact. Whether you're observing the Mona Lisa, or whether you are observing things within you, they are changed by your observation. Now, that's a very important thing. Some of us have talked about inner furniture, the furniture of inner space. And many things should begin to add up once you begin to understand what I have suggested here in this drawing. And if I can persuade somebody to come up and label the drawings in the break, it might help. Now, when we turn our eyes to psychology, we look at the word psychology, and we say, well, the Greek word psyche meant the soul. And psychology really means the study of the soul. But far too many psychologies have never done anything more except study a lot of phenomena related to the personality. The personality's eyes, the personality's hearing, the personality's phobias and drives and ambitions. And so somehow or the other, the soul is never mentioned in psychology. But it is mentioned, of course, in esoteric psychology. It's quite simple. We say that the personality is not just the result of the hereditary equipment that we get from our mothers and fathers via the DNA code. It is not the result of where and how we are born, which is the environment. We say that these factors have even recently been shown to be erroneous. The hereditary equipment that we're supposed to have had was 100,000 genes in our chromosomes. When they came to do the genome, they found there was only 35,000. And so many of the things that we're supposed to derive from our hereditary equipment to make up our personality, there was no basis for them. And the environment, well, we have yet to learn about the environment. We're studying twins, monozygotic twins, dizygotic, and so on. But the important factor of esoteric psychology is the factor of the human soul. And we say that any personality in the world is derived from these three factors, and all that the three factors signify, all that they signify. When we talk about the soul, we talk about a stream of factors. The soul, reincarnation, how old is the soul? Is this a young soul? Is it an old soul? Is it a soul that is looking for a change of direction or a change of purpose? And we talk about karma. What we have done in previous lives decides the kind of life we're going to have in this life and in the next. How else will the pendulum swing back to its origin if we do not take into account what we have done in previous lives and are doing in this one, and we call it karma. And the great advantage of esoteric astrology, which presents you in two-dimensional form, an account of your nature, is that it indicates something of the karma. And if you know why you are suffering, it's a great help. And so there is a third factor, and we call it the soul. And the soul expresses itself if you serve mankind. I made a great study of this, and someday I shall publish a work called The Soul's Purpose. And if we knew why we were here, the purpose, the meaning, and so on, we would know what the soul's purpose is. And by doing the soul's purpose, the soul floods its vehicles with energy. Floods its vehicles with energy because you are manifesting what the soul itself wants. And so the energy pours into the personality via the etheric nadis, via the chakras, but that is a fact of existence. If you become obsessed with your personality, if all you are interested in is the aggrandizement of your personality, the soul will be shut off. The antakarana, the Indian word for the channel, bringing down the energies of the soul, will be obstructed, inhibited. And this can cause what we now today know as endogenous depression, where there is depression that is inexplicable, depression that wells up out of nowhere and is very, very hard to move and can make a life meaningless and absolutely arid, so that the desert is a good symbol of desolation and depression. And so we sometimes choke off the higher self. And the higher self withdraws, quite prepared to withdraw into itself, its energies, and leave it to a later life. Sometimes the activity of the personality is so abominable, so irreparable, that the soul will cut it off and withdraw completely from that personality which has a destiny that one shudders to contemplate. And so this is the nature of man. And after the break, we shall talk about individuation, which is Carl Jung's description of leading the personality through individuation to greater wholeness. And you can see the purpose of the drawing was to show you that wholeness is important. That once you develop wholeness and the energy of the higher self is pouring through you, it passes out of you. And if you teach with your eyes, you teach with your nature, and the teaching comes across and is never forgotten by the pupils, by the students. And if you heal, there's a natural phenomenon about you. You are flooded with the energies of the soul, and we call it esoteric healing. And take the flow of these energies and use them as effectively as possible. And so all these things are related to the affirmation of the soul within you. Not just I am a personality, but I'm that. And my orientation is towards that from now on, day one, tomorrow. And there are certain things that we do to obtain it. And then we learn to recognize, of course, that the soul has a higher center around which the whole of humanity rotates, moves. And then we say, I am, that's I am. And you will not have had a clearer explanation than that for those sacred words that exist in the Old Testament.